I'm Dr. Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com, and this is a special episode of Mastering Nutrition where I go on Dr. Paul Saladino, Carnivore MD's podcast to have a friendly debate about the carnivore diet. This is part one of our very lengthy debate. This episode focuses mostly on whether you can get all your vitamins and minerals on a carnivore diet and how to do it.
This is Mastering Nutrition with Chris Masterjohn. Take control of your health, master the science, and apply it like a pro. Are you ready?
This episode is brought to you by Ample. Ample is a meal in a bottle that takes a total of 2 minutes to prepare, consume, and clean up. It provides a balance of fat, protein, and carbs, plus all the vitamins and minerals you need in a single meal, all from a blend of natural ingredients. It's available in original, vegan, and keto versions, portioned as either 400 or 600 calories per meal. I'm an advisor to Ample, and I use it to save time when I'm working on major projects on a tight schedule. It keeps my brain going while I power through the day, never letting food prep get in the way of my productivity. Head to amplemeal.com and enter the promo code CHRIS15 at checkout for a 15% discount off your first order. This episode is brought to you by Ancestral Supplements Grass-Fed Beef Brain. Our Native American ancestors believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. Ancestral Supplements has a nose-to-tail product line of grass-fed liver, organs, bone marrow, brain, and more, all in the convenience of a capsule. For more information or to buy any of their products, go to ancestralsupplements.com.
Chris Masterjohn, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
It's really good to connect with you in this way. I know a lot of people are looking forward to this conversation, and I have to say from the beginning that I really am grateful for you coming on, and I really have appreciated all of your work over the last 15 to 20 years that you've been doing it. And
thank you.
I definitely feel like you are one of the brightest minds out there, and so it's great to share some ideas with you here.
Sure. Thank you so much.
I've been reading your stuff since it was cholesterol and health, and I was in medical school, man.
That was kind of a while ago. Although I didn't transfer over to chrismasterjohnphd.com till like 2016, I think. So that was the dominant thing. But man, that was a long time. I started that site in 2005.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
It was a long time ago. Yeah, and I was in medical school 2010 to 2014. So yeah, I was reading it.
I didn't even start grad school till 2008.
Yeah. And what were you doing before that?
I got a history degree. I wanted to teach high school social studies, but then in my senior year or super senior year, I had a very bad experience I had a very bad experience in my junior and senior years with vegetarianism and veganism that I resolved in my super senior year. And at that point, I wanted to be a doctor, but I wanted to finish my history degree because I was in my 5th year. And so as soon as I finished my history degree, I started taking all the prerequisites that I'd need for medical school. So that summer, I took the first Chem 1 and Chem 2 that summer. And then the next year, I had like 5 or 6 lab classes, both semesters. Then I ran into some financial trouble that I had to resolve by working full-time in a concrete plant, which made me question the direction of my life. And then I worked at Job Corps teaching the remedial to the GED math. Job Corps is a federally funded program for people who didn't graduate high school to get their GED and to learn a trade and get their driver's license. And I had Math 1. And so to get out of Math 1, you had to take a standardized test that got out. So if you scored the lowest on the standardized test, you wind up in my class. But then also, if you never, ever, ever did any work to get out of the class, you would stay in my class forever. So that was very difficult. Further made me question the direction of my life. then after a couple of years, I finished the 1 or 2 class. Like I needed Bio 2 or something like that, so that I finished it. And then anyway, through the time that I was doing those classes, though, I had professors, coworkers, friends, all telling me I should go into research. And I also myself kind of fell in love with the molecular things. So, so like the things behind the scene, I like people, but my best skill is not taking a body of knowledge and practice and helping people apply it. It's really like brainstorming ideas and coming up with new ideas and new ways to look at things. So I decided to go into PhD in nutritional sciences instead.
And then you taught for a little bit and then decided that your talents were better off in the interwebs, which I think was a very good decision.
Yeah, I did.
For the rest of us, at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think let's kick off this discussion with some consideration. And it kind of follows chronologically, perhaps. I remember reading many years ago, you wrote an article in 2007 when you were still in history, graduate school, I guess, or when you were completing your history degree.
Oh, that was it. That was in between. I was probably working with concrete or teaching addition and subtraction or something like that.
So in 2007, as you were pouring concrete in the concrete factory, you wrote this article.
Oh, no, wait. I was applying to grad school. That's what I was doing then.
Okay. And you wrote this I think it's a really great article about dioxins in food. And dioxins are one of these persistent organic pollutants. And as you and I talked about offline before we started recording, within plant-based circles, this argument of dioxin contamination in food seems to be lessening, but it's still out there. And some have noted that animal foods may have higher levels of dioxins in them and whether we should be concerned about this. So I would love to recapitulate that article with you a little bit and give people a little bit of a rundown on what you wrote there, your perspectives on dioxins and animal foods and whether we should be concerned, because most of the people listening to this podcast are eating a lot of animal foods. Yeah.
So, I mean, I wrote this because there was an argument circulating at the time on exactly that the argument is basically that dioxins, and people make this argument about toxins generally too, that they bioaccumulate up the food chain. And so in animal foods, animals eat plants, animals eat other animals. And so if you have herbivore animals, you're going to bioaccumulate from all the plants to going to accumulate in that animal. And then if you go even worse to eat carnivore animals, then you're going to have even, more exponential accumulation. There's a few problems with it. I mean, first of all, dioxins are kind of an old threat. So, because, and actually it's generally true of environmental issues in general, that we create a problem with technology and then we fix the problem with technology. And sometimes that's a result of regulations and laws, and sometimes it's just a result of technological development. It's usually a result of both, because you generally can't regulate your way out of an environmental mess unless you have the technology to do it anyway. And so in the case of dioxins, it was kind of a combination of both of those. There's a lot of there's one chemical called dioxin, but then there's a bunch of dioxin-related compounds. And so we're really talking about a bunch of pollutants. PCBs and so on fall into this category. And back concerns about the ozone layer and various other things that were going on in the 70s led to some regulations as well as technological development that has basically, at the time that I wrote that article, the exposure to dioxin and dioxin-like compounds had decreased by 95% from its peak. And so it's like, and I believe the peak was around the 70s or early 70s or something like that. And so it's sort of like at that point, you can debate whether you should eat beef or corn, but you're getting 20 times less dioxins than you were a couple decades before that. And the link to cancer, which was the main link, was, there's evidence there, certainly, but it was kind of equivocal too. And so if it was equivocal when you were dealing with people who were 20 times more exposed, then it's going to all the more be kind of like, is this really the main driver of cancer when we've already gotten rid of 95% of our exposure? And then the other main problem is that the data just doesn't line up with a consistent difference between animal and plant foods. So yeah, some animal foods are higher than some plant foods, but like olive oil, some samples of olive oil were really high, some samples of various plant foods. And if anyone, I guess we can put the link to the article in the show notes of this so people can go look at it. But I've got 4 tables of dioxin concentrations in different foods that are in that article where people can make those comparisons. Let me pull one of those up real quickly just to look at it. It's going to take me a second because the hyper.
Yeah, I thought that it was interesting that you highlighted that in the article, that dioxin exposure is much lower than it used to be in the 70s, significantly so, 95% lower, that the bioaccumulation of it is perhaps not as big of a factor because of that, and because of its presence in both plant and animal foods, it's not clear where we're getting it from. And then the other thing that you highlighted in that article was that probably the biggest exposure that our ancestors would have had would have been wood smoke from fires. And so it's probably something that we've been exposed to throughout the majority of our evolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's
at least the last million years of fire.
Yeah, we're certainly less exposed to smoke. I mean, we replaced that a little bit by smoking cigarettes. But now, most people, especially health-conscious people, don't smoke. And if you don't smoke anything, no one's got wood fires in their homes almost. People don't roast on open fires anymore for the most part. So our exposure through that mode is radically decreased. But just to throw out a couple of examples. So olive oil here, the units are picograms of dioxin equivalents per gram of product. And olive oil here is 0.0295. And then there's roast turkey breast is half that. And then whole milk is like, is 0.0087. So it's orders of magnitude lower. Chicken leg with the skin is even lower than that. And so it's like the data is just all over the map. I mean, we can link it there so people can look at the data if they want. It's just not that consistent between animal and plant foods.
And there's one study that people have cited in the past saying that organic animal foods have dioxin as well. But the problem with that study, as far as I can tell, is I can't tell if those animals were fed grains or if they were fed, what they were fed. One of the things that you noted in that article in 2007 was that probably the biggest contributor to dioxin exposure in cattle is what the cattle feeding troughs are made out of, this plasticized material for feeding troughs. Do you remember that part of the article?
No, I don't even remember that. I'd have to reread it. Yeah.
No, I thought that was pretty cool. And you noted in the article that a grass-fed animal, that a pastured animal is not even going to get that exposure to dioxin in the plastic parts of their feeding of the water tanks. And so I strongly debate the notion or the supposition that pasture-raised animals, well-raised animals, grass-fed, grass-finished animals are going to have even the same amounts of dioxin as an animal that's finished on corn or an animal that's in a feedlot drinking from a trough of water that is lined or made from this plasticized material with chlorinated compounds in it. So anyway, that's just an interesting aside. I thought since you've written that article, people might want to hear about that. And we can do more discussion of that in the future. But I think the takeaway from that is that it's probably not as big a deal as some people make it out to be.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a non-issue. I mean, not non-issue. Like, it's an interesting thing to talk about, but it's not a major driver of disease.
Right. And not a reason to avoid eating animal products or avoid eating animal fats.
Well, it's a stupid thing to bring up in a specific distinction between animal and plant foods.
Okay. Yeah. Because they both perhaps have them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because they don't consistently have different amounts of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then let's move on to the next piece of our discussion. You have talked about methionine-glycine ratios. It's something that I've talked about as well. The listeners of this podcast will know that I'm a big advocate for nose-to-tail eating. And one of the reasons that I think it's important to eat tendons is to get glycine. So what is your perspective? Like, tell us about methionine glycine balance, why it matters, why we should think about it. What's the equation here?
Yeah. So first of all, methionine these are both amino acids. Methionine is a very important so both of them can be turned into proteins. There's many amino acids that are important to turn into proteins. Methionine is arguably an essential amino acid. Methionine and cysteine together can both partly fulfill the requirement for sulfur amino acids. So you need one, the other, or both. Glycine is not considered an essential amino acid. Some people consider it a conditionally essential amino acid because we can synthesize it. However, the research is pretty strongly indicating that we can't synthesize enough of it. So we basically have a cap of a few grams of glycine that we can synthesize, and we fall short of our glycine needs by 10 to 60 grams a day. Now, besides making proteins, methionine is particularly important for the production of anything with sulfur. So taurine is important in the retina and the brain especially. Sulfate is important for detoxification. It's important for regulating hormones. It's important for producing sulfated compounds that help lubricate the joints and make things slide around easily. It's very important to basically all your connective tissues. And it's very important even for cardiovascular disease as well, because it helps regulate blood lipids and things like that. And then also glutathione is the master antioxidant of the cell, and it's a major component of detoxification. And it's probably the single most important thing when you're talking about preventing asthma. And not just asthma, but glutathione status is worse in diabetes. And probably that is one of the major drivers of diabetic complications. And actually even the process of diabetes risk. So there's sort of a vicious cycle where you need insulin to synthesize glutathione. And as you lose insulin or insulin sensitivity, you start getting more glycation damage because glutathione protects against that. And you lose glutathione. The glycation damage makes the insulin sensitivity worse. You lose more glutathione. That makes the insulin sensitivity more worse, et cetera, just kind of spirals on. So methionine is super important. We don't want to demonize methionine at all. We want lots of methionine. But glycine, on the other hand, the more methionine you take in, the more glycine you lose, because when methionine comes in, you can have excess and you buffer it with glycine. If depending on how extreme the excess is, you might recover that glycine, but you might just pee out the glycine as well, depending on, how much extra methionine came in at any given time. And if you lose glycine, you lose some of the important roles of glycine. Glycine's been shown to help stabilize blood sugar when taken with a meal. It's been shown to help with sleep at night. Glycine is generally an inhibitory neurotransmitter that helps calm and relax you in most cases. And glycine also is very important to collagen synthesis. So that's 95% of your bone protein. It's a major constituent of your skin and all of your connective tissues. So if you are losing glycine constantly because of the excess methionine, you got a problem. Now, if you look at ancestral diets, some ancestral diets were more plant heavy, some were more animal heavy, but the animal ones were nose to tail. And one of the things that's very interesting is if you have a nose to tail animal-based diet, you're going to have a very similar methionine to glycine ratio as if you have a vegan diet, because you tend to have a very good balance between methionine and glycine in plant foods. You tend to have a very good balance between methionine and glycine in whole animals, but not in specific animal foods. So muscle meat is very heavy in methionine, relatively lower in glycine. Collagen-rich tissues such as bones and skin proteins are very rich in glycine, have very little methionine, right? So you can eat a plant where it's balanced, or you can eat an animal where it's balanced, but you can't pick and choose your animal parts and still retain the balance.
And this is one of the concerns that I've had with primarily meat-based carnivore diets, which will be lots of muscle meat, which will be relatively speaking, high in methionine and lower in glycine. And as you're saying, if we overaccumulate methionine or we overtake in methionine, the excess methyl groups in methionine can get buffered by the glycine, and they can create a sort of a relative glycine deficiency. And as you're suggesting, at least in free living humans that are not on ketogenic diets or eating carnivore diets, most people in the population do tend to run a pretty significant glycine deficiency. You quoted some numbers from that study that were 10 to 60 grams a day of glycine, which is quite a big, that's a big deficiency of glycine for someone to have. Yeah, that's not a good thing. And if we don't have enough glycine, we won't be able to make collagen adequately, and we won't be able to make glutathione. And then you highlighted other roles of glycine in the body, neurotransmitter, important for glucose control. It's a big deal. So the sort of simple ancestral fix is just eat the whole animal, get some tendinous tissues. A lot of people are not familiar with what those are, but one of the things that I like to do is eat suet, or the fat of the animal, which always has kind of connective collagenous tissue with it, or just straight tendons, or just not picking the tendons off your steaks, getting lots of tendinous tissue with your steaks. Does that sound reasonable?
It does. I think one of the things that we can talk about later when we get into nutrient needs and carnivore diets is there's a little bit of a catch-22 here, in the sense that a lot of the important essential vitamins and minerals are much more abundant in the muscle meat. And so the more fat you have in the diet and the more collagenous tissue you have in the diet, the more you displace those, and the more you need to really think about the nutrient density of your animal foods. Because when we get into it later, there's a number of nutrients where, if you're conscious about planning your diet, you could eat certain shellfish, even certain fin fish, and even certain land animal products like dark chicken meat for vitamin K, where you could design the diet well and meet those nutritional needs. But if you just take a baseline of steak and then you displace half of it with fat and collagenous tissue, you might actually wind up contributing to some nutrient deficiencies because of the good thing you did. Right? Yes, you do want to put that collagenous tissue in. It's just, if you're only otherwise eating steak, then now you have to rethink your steak even more because of the other vitamins and minerals. So I think that's one thing we can get into later.
Right. And, I think it will be something we can highlight, that there are some vitamins and minerals that are in the muscle tissue that are sort of water soluble. There are a few that are fat soluble. I think there are some vitamins in the fat that are valuable for people, but I do think it's important to think about the proportions. And people might, at the end of this discussion, even though we're just starting this discussion now, I hope that at the end of this discussion, people will not have sort of a spinning head and think, oh, it's too complicated. Because one of the best comments that I've seen on Instagram, and perhaps our job in all of this for people, is to make it complex and then to make it simple as we're making it complex. And I'll clarify what I mean by that. But
that's what I like to do.
You make it complex and then make it simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, make it complex, look at the details, and then look at the patterns that you see in those details, and think about how to translate that into a relatively simple diet, so that people don't have to think, where am I getting my manganese or my K2 from? It's just all kind of in there within a cohesive dietary framework. That's kind of what I think you and I are both trying to do from a little bit different perspectives, but same intention. Yeah. So this comment on Instagram was like, nutrition can't be that complex because humans have thrived for the last 3 million years. And I thought, well, to some extent, that's kind of true. I mean, within our environment in the natural world, there has to be some way to get at least a reasonable amount of all the nutrients we need to have reasonable function and reproductive function. And so I think that Tim Ferriss has a saying, it's not simple, but it's not complex. Would you agree with that?
Would I agree with everything you just said, or with Tim Ferriss?
my rambling.
Oh, okay. No, I wouldn't. So I agree with the sentiment. Well, actually, most of what you said was citing this Instagram comment. So that's mainly what I'm thinking in my head when I say no. Let me tackle that Instagram comment.
Yeah.
So I think the sentiment is coming from a reasonable place, but I think there are some important flaws in the reasoning there. So first of all, and this is not my major point, but I think it is a major point. plenty of people have had nutrient deficiencies over the last several million years, and it's absurd to think otherwise. If you look at so first of all, we don't know jack about details of people that were never alive before we studied them. We can make inferences based on skeletons and stuff like that, but that knowledge is very limited, and the inferences are always very controversial. Like the inferences about Paleolithic ancestors from bones is not controversial in the paleosphere. So when you have carnivores versus non-carnivores versus keto versus plant-based people in paleo, debating that never comes up. But just go to Google Scholar and type in osteological paradox, and you'll find that within people that look at skeletons, the inferences that you make about the health and nutrition of Paleolithic people from bones is extremely controversial. What we know is that anthropological nutrition, where we've had explorers who have lived with and among or otherwise studied extant hunter-gatherers and other non-modernized people over the course, especially of the early 20th century, when a lot of these people were disappearing, but also to some extent now there's some remaining. Well, one thing that we know is that they know about nutritional deficiencies, and they know about the foods that cure them and prevent them. So that means that they've acquired a body of knowledge over time through getting nutritional deficiencies and figuring out how to fix them. So it's just not true that humans never got nutritional deficiencies through the last 3 million years, and then all of a sudden white bread came up and we got it. Like, yeah, there were things about the Industrial Revolution that made nutritional deficiencies much worse, especially for a period of time before we figured out how to deal with them. But there was always an issue with food. I mean, one of the reasons we developed agriculture in the first place was because food scarcity became a reality. Hunter-gathering couldn't sustain hunter-gatherers because they outbred their capacity to hunt and gather. So they developed agriculture. And then, agriculture made things worse because it didn't occur to anyone that you can't just grow one crop and eat all your calories from it. But until they all got disease from that. But even before that, you think in the food scarcity that caused mass deaths that led people to make agriculture and then conquer everyone else, you don't think people suffered from nutrient deficiencies then? Of course they did. So that's one thing. But I would go back to a couple principles. So first of all, very general principles that I think can be applied to carnivore but aren't really carnivore specific. Number one is, we are all unique individuals, and your needs are not going to be mine. Mine are not going to be yours. Some people are, if you were to design a diet optimal for nutritional adequacy, diversity would be one of the things that you'd focus on. And that's for the same reason that people diversify in economic portfolios. There's things that are good for you, like the benefits of certain economic assets, nutrients. There's things that are bad for you, toxins in food, assets that fail in investment. And if you diversify across the foods, you have maximal ability to get everything that you need, not get too much of one thing, and not have to micromanage your diet much. But when you start restricting foods, you're like, if you go carnivore, or you go vegan, or you go keto, or you go low fat, or you go low carb, or whatever, you start shifting your portfolio to be skewed in a certain way. And that skew might work great for some people and might not work very well for other people because, for example, one person might have a genetic predisposition to be very bad at getting certain nutrients from plant foods, but some other people might have a very, like, for example, a lot of people are very bad at getting vitamin A from plant foods because they can't convert carotenoids into retinol. Those people are not going to do that well in a vegan diet, most likely. But then there could be other people, maybe there's predispositions to have a higher need for vitamin C. Anything that could predispose you to oxidative stress could raise your need for vitamin C. And so maybe you're not going to do that well on a carnivore diet, where you may get enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy, but you may not get enough to optimize for antioxidant status for people who have high oxidative burdens or something like that. So your needs aren't mine, mine aren't yours, and that Instagram commenters aren't ours, et cetera, vice versa. But also, our needs change over time. And so we need to look at this pretty dynamically. We're eating a diet where something might work great for us now, and then all of a sudden we develop some kind of health problem on it, and then we need to fix it or we need to tweak it. What we may benefit like enormously from cutting oxalates out of our diet because the oxalates are giving us kidney stones or something like that. Or we may benefit from cutting out soluble fiber from our diet because it's messing with our microbiome or something like that. But we may have then marginal vitamin C intake where 10 years later it starts to catch up with us or something like that. That would be an example of that could be applied to carnivore. For me, in my own story, I don't know what I was missing on a vegan diet, but I was missing a lot and it really messed with my mind.
Well, I think most vegan diets are missing a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. But then, I started really focusing on red meat, which is great. And focused on a really animal heavy diet, but animal heavy diets in general provide a lot more absorbable iron than plant heavy diets do. And it turns out that I'm homozygous for a genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis. And so if I don't balance my diet right and I put all these iron heavy foods and none of the plants that inhibit iron absorption and I don't give blood, then my iron levels tend to go too high and I start feeling kind of crappy all the time. But that's not something that I experienced when I was vegan. It's a dynamic thing. Like when I was vegan, my highest priority was to stuff organ meats and red meat into myself to fix what veganism did to me. But 5 years later, I wasn't starving for animal-based nutrients, and I was overloading myself with certain things because of how my genetics interact with those foods, right? So my genetics make me different than you, but my genetics also predispose me to, have different needs 5 years. That iron, a great example of this would be a woman who's genetically predisposed to hemochromatosis. And for 30, 40, 50 years, probably, 30, 40 years, she's protected by heavy menstruation. She's predisposed to anemia her whole life. Then all of a sudden she goes through perimenopause and then menopause, or she develops amenorrhea for some reason before that. She goes on birth control, whatever. All of a sudden, she's not losing iron in her menstrual fluid. And all of a sudden, she is vulnerable to the genetic predisposition underlying her for hemochromatosis. So our needs are different from each other and in flux all the time. And over the last 3 million years or whatever it was, nutrition, we don't know how complicated nutrition was, but, if you look at these hunter-gatherers who have been disappearing, ethnographers have found that they knew an awful lot about how different foods treat different ailments. Like the Maasai are quite famous, who are a cattle herding group in Kenya and Tanzania. They're quite famous for how their warriors eat mostly animal foods. But ethnographers have also found that they had something like 180 or 240, I don't remember the exact number, but they knew of hundreds of different medicinal uses of the different plants that were in their environment. So these are...
we can talk about the Maasai later. Yeah. We're covering a lot here. Yeah.
But the point here is that for the past 3 million years, most likely this one person being different from another, one person's needs changing over time as their own physiology develops, is probably a constant factor that people develop bodies of knowledge around. Just because these people lived way before we do and they didn't have books or the internet doesn't mean that they didn't know jack about their environment and how they could change things to make some conditions better or how some things cause disease. Like, we don't know what their body of knowledge was 200,000 years ago, but I bet they had one,
Yeah. So much there to unpack. And there's lots of little things in there that we'll try and hit on. I do think diversity is important. I think that you and I would see diversity differently through a different lens. Sure. I see diversity through a diversity of organ meats and a diversity of sort of eating nose to tail. And I think that you're seeing diversity, wanting to diversify outside of the plant foods, which is something that we'll talk a lot about that in this podcast. I think the point of that Instagram comment was, hey, look, humans have made it this far. Like, it at some level, yes, I agree with you. Humans certainly have had nutritional deficiencies throughout our evolution. We know that. Look at Otzi the Iceman. I guess he's what, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. And if we look at the Dixon Mounds from 12,000 years ago, which is a sort of an anthropologic dig site in Iowa at the confluence of a couple of rivers where they can compare skeletons of pre-agricultural and agricultural humans, we certainly see a decline in the health of people when they began an agricultural society. But if you look at the bones and the health of people even before they were agricultural, they were not exemplary. And so you're right, like even some recent hunter-gatherer tribes, like you said, from the bone, from the osteological evidence, appear to have not had exemplary health. But throughout our evolution, humans have made it to reproductive age. We've made it so that we've continued as a species. So it can't be quantum physics. It's got to be at least a little bit. Now, then the question becomes, what is our goal and what is our metric? Is our metric living to 80 years old with vibrant health? Is our metric being 67-year-old Mark Sisson kicking a huge amount of ass and being basically like the most radical, almost 70-year-old dude on the planet? That's a pretty high bar to set for a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago. I don't think we necessarily achieved that, but that was, I think, all that we were going at with an Instagram comment. And yeah, we'll talk about the Messiah and all other stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the deficiencies that we could get eating only meat. So I think we're going to dig into this carnivore stuff. I want to dig into nose to tail. This is really your area of expertise, so I'm excited to have this part of the conversation with you. So if someone were to want to do a carnivore diet, and we've already kind of hinted at this, and only eat muscle meat, what are some deficiencies that they could develop? And we touched on this a little bit with methionine and glycine. Perhaps the first of them would be that if they're not getting enough connective tissue, they could have some imbalances there. What are some other things you think could potentially develop in that sort of a situation?
So I would say there's 2 nutrients that I would consider high risk, and then there's 5 that I would consider conditional risk. The high risk ones would be vitamin C and folate, and the conditional risk ones would be manganese, molybdenum, potassium, magnesium, and vitamin K. By conditional risk, I mean basically that you would have to manage your diet well and think carefully about how you design it in order to make sure that you don't run deficient in those things. By high risk, I mean there's a pretty substantial chance that no matter what you do, you might not have enough. So I guess let's tackle vitamin C first, because I think that's probably, and all of this, by the way, has room for controversy, and I'm sure we can have plenty about vitamin C. But with vitamin C, so if you're just trying to prevent scurvy, I think that most people on a carnivore diet that has fresh meat, especially if it's cooked gently and marinated in an acidic medium, because acid preserves vitamin C, are probably going to get enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. However, it would be a lot easier to do that, or your chances of minimizing scurvy would be much better if the diet emphasized fish roe and shellfish, especially clams, mussels, oysters, and crab. And that's because, if you look, so there are some organ meats that are very high in vitamin C. Liver is one of them. Adrenal glands are the highest. But none of the organ meats can you eat enough of to take advantage of the fact that they're richer, where you can rely completely on them. In other words, liver has a good 15 to 20 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams of food. But you really shouldn't eat more than 200 grams of liver a week. And that's because you could overdose on vitamin A and copper. So I think if you eat liver, your risk of scurvy is going to be a lot lower, just because those 200 grams already provide a lot of extra vitamin C. But there's going to be a lot of variation how people cook foods, for one. And so not everyone likes their meat rarely cooked. And not everyone wants to marinate it in acidic medium. You're probably going to have some 30 or 40% loss of the vitamin C if you don't, and so on. And so if you emphasize some of those seafoods that are richer in vitamin C, like fish roe and some of the shellfish, I think you're in a better place. But I think where the big controversy is going to be is that I think the data support aiming for at least 90 milligrams a day and 100 to 150 milligrams a day for maximal suppression of chronic disease risk. And the experimental evidence on depletion and repletion to fix scurvy is very clear about what you need for an intake and then blood level. And probably you and I don't have any substantial disagreement on that. Maybe a little on the practical stuff, but not too much. Whereas it's very difficult to study how much vitamin C you need to minimize chronic disease risk, because there's no RCTs of vegan diets or carnivore diets. And there's certainly no RCTs of vitamin C supplementation that take into account any of the things that people want to claim are contextual factors. So a carnivore might say, well, this thing about my diet reduces my vitamin C requirement, or a vegan might say the same thing about other aspects of their diet. So because we don't have that, we have to look at the best evidence that we do have. And that means looking at observational studies and looking at supplementation studies that look at surrogate markers. So for example, supplementation studies suggest that when we get 100 to 150 milligrams, we are maximizing our plasma concentrations of vitamin C. We're maximizing our white blood cell levels of vitamin C in ways that support better immune function. And the blood levels that you get up there are around the ones that are associated with lower risks of CVD, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers in observational studies. So I think there's plenty of room for controversy there. But my perspective here is when we don't know exactly what we need, we should aim for the intake of a nutrient that is well above any question of whether marginal increases would improve our chronic disease risk, and well below any question of whether we are getting any adverse effects. So getting 150 milligrams of vitamin C puts us at the top of what anyone could really advocate with any considerable quality evidence would provide any benefit, and well under what anyone would argue would have any kind of toxicity. And so I think that would be very difficult to get on a carnivore diet.
Yeah, you make some great points there. I'll just highlight a few things. I've seen a little bit different numbers for the liver content of vitamin C in the same ballpark, but I'm also under the impression that thymus, pancreas, kidney is perhaps the best source of vitamin C that I've found, because as far as I can tell, there's no reason to limit your consumption of kidney. The data that I saw on nutritiondata.self.com data that I saw for kidney suggested 100 grams had 20 to 30 milligrams of vitamin C.
100 grams of what?
Of kidney.
Okay.
Yeah. And then thymus, I think, has been studied with something, I couldn't tell you the numbers directly off the top of my head, something in the same ballpark. And I think that traditionally, perhaps we would have relished those foods. Adult animals probably would not have had large thymuses, but the brain is also pretty high in vitamin C as well. So, but I like that you highlighted a few things there about
I don't
shellfish.
disagree with that at all.
Yeah. So, and the studies that I've seen on the Inuits, and we can talk about the Inuits more in the future, estimated about 38 milligrams of vitamin C a day for them. Whether or not that's optimal is all that stuff that you highlighted, and we can talk about that. But I do think
the Inuit ate plant foods. So what do we know what that breakdown was?
I don't actually. I think that I'd have to go back to the actual study, but I think that the premise of the study was saying that it was primarily from. And
when was it?
Animal foods. I'd have to find the actual reference for you.
Because the modern Inuit, their primary source of vitamin C is tang.
Yeah. This is old Inuit studies, 1930s, 1940s, probably around the time of Villemer and things like that. Yeah.
So Weston Price made a point that there was some lining of a stomach of a whale that they ate that was really high in vitamin C.
Yeah.
And so I think one really interesting anecdote from Price's work. So do you talk about Price on your show much?
I really appreciate Weston Price. I think my listeners will know who he is, but
okay. So Weston Price was a dental researcher turned pioneer of nutritional anthropology that studied the intersection between dental health and more broadly physical and mental health with what he called the displacing foods of modern commerce that were spreading at the time that he was studying, which was in the 30s and 40s: white bread, white flour, white sugar, et cetera, et cetera. And he did a lot of documentation of what people ate in the Arctic, where I don't think there was ever a human population anywhere on Earth that ate a fully carnivorous diet, but I think the closest you get are the diets of the Arctic. And I think one thing that's really interesting as an anecdote to put in here is that the natives in Canada in the Arctic that he was studying, I don't remember the name of the tribe, he asked them if they knew about scurvy, and they did. And he asked them what they did about it. And they told him that scurvy was a white man's disease. And he said, why? And he said, because the white man never asks the Indian how they avoid scurvy. So long story short, they went back to the chief, and the chief said that it was okay for them to give away the secret because Price was there to tell him not to eat the food in the white man's store. And so they said the way that they prevent scurvy is that whenever they kill a moose, they cut out this big ball of fat above the kidney. They called it a little ball of fat. That was the adrenal gland. And they cut it up so that every little Indian and every big Indian in the tribe gets a little piece of it. So what I find really interesting is that they were eating a mostly carnivorous diet. And in theory, they're eating nose to tail. And in theory, their muscle meats probably give them 1 milligram of vitamin C per 100 grams or whatever. And yet they knew about scurvy, and they really put an emphasis on the adrenal gland. What do you make of that? Because you're a nose to tail advocate, so this isn't really arguing against your point at all. But it really seems like they're not getting that much vitamin C from the other tissues in their cases.
It's an interesting anecdote. I think about it from the context of what we've already discussed, that scurvy is probably the beginning of a continuum of things. And the doses of vitamin C required to prevent scurvy are probably lower than doses of vitamin C that we need to be optimal for humans. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about now is, if we're going to eat a nose to tail carnivore diet, do we need more, or do we need to focus on organ meats that are particularly rich? The thing I've wondered about, I've heard that anecdote before. I don't know if it was you or somebody else. Maybe I read it in one of Price's books. Yeah. Is that I don't know how big a moose adrenal gland is, but on humans, they're pretty small. And
well, a moose is bigger than a human.
Right. But again, like, it's probably not even 100. I would guess it's probably not even 100 grams. Maybe 200 grams maximum for an adrenal gland. Do you know what the actual content of vitamin C in an adrenal gland is?
I don't have that data in front of me, but I do have the data that I distilled from the databases where I put adrenal glands in the 50 to 100 milligram range per 100 grams of food.
Oh, yeah.
Because what I did was I have a class of Vitamins and Minerals 101, and I tier the foods according to what would you eat, where 1 serving a day would provide the target, 3 to 5, et cetera, et cetera. Uh-huh. So I just pulled that out from my notes. And so I don't have the exact number, but it's somewhere between 50 and 100 milligrams per 100 grams.
I just can't imagine that they would be able to get enough adrenal gland in that sense, because just like you mentioned with liver, and we can talk about liver and potential downsides based on the data of eating too much vitamin A, eating a whole lot of adrenal gland could be a very bad thing from a mineralocorticoid balance for a lot of reasons, or even a glucocorticoid balance.
I had a friend who ate too much adrenal gland once and went into she took an ice bath after that because she was burning up so much. She went borderline nuts for the night. Because there's adrenaline in it.
Yeah. It's not a good thing to eat a bunch. So I cannot imagine that. And I don't know where this is, and I couldn't cite a source. So the listener will have to pardon me. But I've also heard people, I feel like I've heard in ancestral circles that sometimes people did not eat the adrenal gland for that reason, because they knew that it was it's too potent. They had to be really careful. So I can't imagine.
It wouldn't surprise me, but I mean, either Price made it up, which I doubt, or that tribe had that thing. I think one of the issues is that vitamin C is extremely unstable. And so depending on how you're processing the other tissues, you might be very reliant on a few milligrams of extra vitamin C if you're preserving and cooking the meats in a way that's leading to a lot of loss of vitamin C. Or in other cases you might not, right? Because vitamin C, vitamin C is going to be destroyed in freeze thaw cycles for one, and that might be relevant if you're not eating the meat right away in the Arctic. And it's also going to be unstable to heavy cooking, especially if it's not in the acidic marinade. So maybe they just weren't optimizing the vitamin C that they could get from those other things. I think what's mostly interesting to me is that they had a conception of scurvy. And so the lack of plant diets in the Arctic was relevant to the risk of scurvy. It's, that's not to say that you can't not have scurvy on a well-designed carnivore diet. But it is to say that a carnivore, a largely but not entirely carnivorous diet, similar to what some groups were eating in the Arctic, doesn't seem to provide a giant margin for scurvy, which I think is important because, if you're like, you sent me a paper before the show that was looking at experiments done many decades ago, where they were looking at how many milligrams of vitamin C does it take to prevent scurvy. And, in that paper, one of the things that I thought was interesting was the people generally took 3 to 4 months to develop scurvy. But then when they did, there were people who spontaneously developed coronary symptoms that appeared to be a heart attack that they then solved by injecting them with a gram of vitamin C, or internal bleeding, and things like that. So I don't think you want to operate in the margins of the risk of scurvy. I think you want to be way the hell out of those margins. You know what I mean? Because scurvy isn't just bleeding gums. It's very dangerous, and it can take a very long time to develop. So there were some studies where they just put people on a 0C diet and they took a month to develop scurvy. There were the study that you gave me, they took 3 to 4 months to develop scurvy because they'd been given 70 milligrams a day for the 6 weeks before they went on the depletion diet. But you develop scurvy when your total body pool is under 300 milligrams, and your total body pool can be as much as 2 grams. So if you were supplementing with vitamin C every time you had a cold, you're probably peeing a lot of it out, and you're probably putting a lot of it into that extra body storage. And if you have 2 grams of vitamin C for your total body pools, it's probably going to take you many, many, many years to develop scurvy. Even on a 0C diet, it might take you a year or more. If you're on a 8 milligram a day vitamin C diet, maybe it takes you 10 years to develop scurvy. But when you develop scurvy, this is the thing, is if you don't have warning signs and then all of a sudden you have scurvy, you're also at the point where you could spontaneously develop more serious problems than bleeding gums or funny bruising like patterns.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to highlight is I've read in some papers, there is analysis of plant foods that are cooked that show significant loss of vitamin C. But Absolutely. There's never been a study that I'm aware of that showed significant loss of vitamin C in animal foods. And some people writing about vitamin C have highlighted that perhaps there may be a difference in the vitamin C stability. Again, at this point, we'll probably squarely move into the realm of conjecture and controversy with all this stuff. Sure. But at least according to the USDA nutritional database, there's a pretty significant loss of spinach with 28.1 milligrams per 100 grams of vitamin C fresh and 9.8 milligrams per 100 grams once it's cooked. And I don't have the data about how it's cooked and for how long, but raw and cooked forms of pork liver had essentially the same amount of vitamin C with 25.3 milligrams per 100 grams and 23.6 milligrams per 100 grams respectively. So I think that unfortunately, most of this research about these nutrients will never be done. And and I fear that. But I do wonder about if the losses from vitamin C with cooking or storage of animal foods are the same as they are with plant foods. I think kind of the whole.
Can I jump in real quick? So I don't have that in front of me. I did look at it before, and I was under the impression when I looked at it before, but unfortunately I don't remember the details of why that there were similar losses with animal and plant foods. But I don't want to defend that point because I don't have it in front of me and I don't remember the details. But I think I would not take liver as representative there, because liver is very high in reducing agents that are going to stabilize probably vitamin C. And an excellent example of this would be folate, which is very stable in frozen liver and very unstable in frozen everything else. It could be an animal versus plant difference, but I think it's probably a liver versus not liver difference, because, for example, glutathione is what recycles vitamin C in vivo. It's certainly going to be a major recycler of vitamin C in shelved products, and most glutathione in the body is in the liver. So I just think it does support your point that if liver is going to be a major source of vitamin C on a carnivore diet, I just suspect that that's probably more of a significant to liver versus non-liver comparison.
Yeah, that's a great point. I appreciate that. I'll just add another few points that, again, will be things that we won't be able to fully prove, but I will note that though I don't ascribe to the glucose ascorbate antagonism theory, I do think it's possible that many of the studies that have been done with vitamin C and indices in neutrophils and the plasma could have contextual differences on ketogenic versus carbohydrate-based diet. And I'll just put that out there as a hypothesis that we can't know. And
why do you think that?
Because of the large body of evidence that suggests that ketogenic physiology improves oxidative status. So oxidative stress, there are a number of studies that could show you that I've got pulled up that suggest, at least in rats and I believe some in humans, markers of oxidative stress in the mitochondria and brains, in the hippocampus, are improved on ketogenic diets. So I think that,
can you share that with me now?
Yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about, and I want to see if it's the same study.
So there's multiple studies here. Let me pull it up. So
is there a chat in this Zoom thing?
I can tell you the names. So
could you email them to me? I mean, maybe we can look at them for a part 2. That might be more efficient. Okay, so I've seen the paper on. I want to. I'll address that and then back up a little bit about the antagonism. So I have seen the paper about the hippocampus. My recollection from that paper was that they showed that the oxidative stress markers actually worsened on the ketogenic diet, which then caused a hormetic response that improved glutathione status and other things like that. But anyway, I don't think that translates to vitamin C status directly. So I think there are some things that we really do know about what affects vitamin C that are reasonable to put forward. So first of all, protein is, first of all, vitamin C is needed for carnitine synthesis, and you get a lot of preformed carnitine on a carnivore diet, so that might spare needs.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was.
Vitamin C is recycled in vivo by glutathione, and so protein is what you make glutathione from. So certainly protein in the diet is going to spare vitamin C needs. Insulin is a direct positive regulator of glutathione status. So you're going to get more insulin. The best insulin, the most insulin signaling is when you're lean and you have adequate calories and you have carbohydrate in your diet.
We should talk about that because that's an important point that I've heard you mention. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but let's at least, I'll let you finish your point, but we should at least dog ear that.
Okay. So, having adequate calories, having insulin sensitivity, and having insulin are all going to be good for glutathione as well. And yeah, yes, oxidate. I agree that if you have oxidative stress, you're going to worsen your vitamin C status. But I don't. I think it would be very. It would be a very. We can open that up, but I think it would be a very long conversation about whether carnivore or keto is going to improve oxidative stress markers.
Yeah, that would be a pretty granular discussion that we'd have to look at the mitochondria and stuff. I'm just looking at a number of studies that have suggested that. And
why don't we share those studies with each other and maybe do a part 2 where we just break open that topic in detail if you want?
Yeah.
I mean,
I talked about
it now too, but
no. Let's talk about the insulin stuff. I talked about it a little bit in the podcast I did previously with Dom D'Agostino.
Yeah.
He had mentioned that through his experiences in ketogenic physiology, beta hydroxybutyrate had influence on the molecule Q in the mitochondrial electron transport chain and led to the production of less superoxide dismutase, less production of superoxide, requiring less superoxide dismutase to manage that radical molecule. But yeah, it would be interesting to really dig into that and see what is known about oxidative status in carbohydrate versus ketogenic fat-based physiology. The thing that I've heard you say there, and that I've heard you say on other podcasts, I want to talk about this. Can you share with me, or perhaps you could expand on the fact, because insulin signaling, I think is, and I don't know that I think you will agree with this, insulin signaling is much more than the absolute insulin number. And though on a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet, the absolute insulin numbers will be much lower, I don't think that we can say that the glutathione levels will be lower, because through all of the metrics that I'm aware of, these people are extremely insulin sensitive. And so I think that we're not talking about absolute insulin numbers here. We're talking about insulin signaling, and that you could have a low insulin level and still have very robust insulin signaling on a ketogenic physiology. Because perhaps I'm misunderstanding that statement, but to me it sounds like if insulin levels are lowered, and I know in other podcasts you've also suggested insulin to glucagon ratio, so we can talk about that too. But yeah, I'm not convinced that with lower overall insulin levels you're going to have less glutathione, nor have I observed that clinically. And I think that the ultimate arbiter and the leveler would be insulin sensitivity rather than absolute levels of insulin.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to observe clinically on the basis that there's no good tests for glutathione status. I mean, LabCorp has a whole blood glutathione test, but ideally you'd be wanting to look at the ratio of glutathione to oxidized glutathione in the plasma, and looking at the redox status, which you can calculate from that. The only lab that I know that offers that is HDRI Health, which I hate that company for various reasons. I shouldn't say that. They're very frustrating to work with. And also in these studies too, if you want to look at whole body glutathione status, you should be looking at it in the liver too, because that's where the main impacts are going to be. But also the fact that this is very confounded by insulin sensitivity, as you indicated. So it's certainly the case that someone can be insulin resistant and then can go on a diet that restricts carbohydrate to achieve greater insulin sensitivity, and can wind up with more insulin signaling than they had before. And particular if someone has diabetes physiology and then is moving away from diabetes physiology towards healthy physiology, they should have lower glucagon levels, because glucagon is raised in diabetes.
Right.
What I said is that you would have the most insulin signaling if you were lean and insulin sensitive and you ate carbohydrate. I don't think that deserves any controversy, because I mean, sure, you can have plenty of controversy over the practical details of how to apply that statement, but there's no controversy over whether for a given amount of insulin sensitivity, do you have more insulin signaling on a carbohydrate diet versus a protein diet versus a fat diet.
Well, I think that also it's very hard, as you indicated, to really quantify insulin sensitivity. And, without having the microscopic spaceship and looking at PI3K and all these downstream signaling molecules after insulin binds to its receptor.
You don't have to do that. Those are telling you the mechanism of how insulin did a thing. But if we're talking about insulin and glutathione, all you have to look at is glutathione synthesis.
Yes, that is the ultimate thing. So, but I think that actually brings up a great point. So I would suggest that it's very hard to know based on absolute levels of insulin and insulin sensitivity what the actual objective amount of insulin signaling is. And so the reason we're talking about... You mean
what the ideal level is, or
what the actual level is? Because it seems a little bit of an extrapolation to kind of put those two together, because I don't think we can actually know what the insulin sensitivity looks like and what the level of insulin signaling is for any given person with their insulin sensitivity.
Well, I agree with that, and I would sort of like support it one step further by saying that there is no such number, because there are multiple bifurcations in the insulin signaling pathway that lead to different things that don't all have the same sensitivity. So there's no such thing as a unified measure of insulin sensitivity, because there are so many things downstream from insulin.
Right. Yeah.
So not only do we not know the number, but there is no such number.
And so I think that ultimately what we're talking about here, just to bring it to a surface level or make it functional for people, is antioxidant status. And you brought up that it's difficult to measure glutathione levels. You can measure serum glutathione with a Genova NutriEval, but that doesn't give you a ratio of oxidized to reduced. But there are a number of other metrics that one could measure to look at oxidation status, quote unquote. And
like what?
Like lipid peroxides, 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine would be the ones that are also on a NutriEval.
So those are markers of oxidative damage,
right?
Which I think is a more extreme situation than oxidative stress. But look, we brought this up in the context of supporting vitamin C requirements, and if that's the concern, you can just measure fasting plasma vitamin C. I mean, that's the simplest thing to do.
Yeah, you could just measure fasting plasma vitamin C, and the cutoffs for that we had discussed. I mean, I think that there are some. Again, the problem with that, at least theoretically, is that if we're looking at plasma vitamin C status, that doesn't really tell us what we're thinking about. The reason we're thinking about vitamin C is antioxidant status. And so what does vitamin C do, right? We want enough vitamin C to make collagen to not get scurvy, but like we've talked about, there's this gray zone where we're trying to optimize antioxidant status. The chapter that you had sent on vitamin C suggested lots of roles for vitamin C that are actually pretty controversial. We don't really know clearly that vitamin C is involved in preventing LDL oxidation. Those studies were mixed. There are many of these parts that we think that's what it's doing, but as they note, vitamin C is water soluble. Lipid fractions are fat soluble.
I think what's controversial is the clinical endpoints. I think there are some very non-controversial statements that you could make about vitamin C's role in the antioxidant system. So mechanistic evidence is pretty clear that in a cell, and LDL oxidation is different because LDL is not a cell.
Right.
But in a cell, vitamin E is present at the aqueous interface of the lipid membrane. And when vitamin E is oxidized, it directly transfers the burden of that oxidation onto vitamin C that is in the aqueous phase at the border of the lipid membrane. That vitamin C is recycled by glutathione. That glutathione is recycled by glutathione reductase, which basically takes B vitamins and energy derived from glucose in the pentose phosphate pathway to supply those electrons up through that cycle.
NADPH.
I don't think that's controversial. So you can say, like, do you really need 50 micromoles per liter plasma fasting vitamin C in order to prevent heart disease? And if so, is it mediated through LDL oxidation? I think there's plenty of room for controversy about that.
Right.
But it's not the case that. But I think we can just acknowledge that vitamin C is an antioxidant, and that it's probably the case that the bulk of what you do with vitamin C when you have excess above what's needed to prevent scurvy is probably much more related to that antioxidant function than it is to supporting enzymes of collagen synthesis.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm not sure. I don't have really any problem with people taking 75 or 100 milligrams of vitamin C as a supplement per day. We can talk about the upper limits. If people are on a carnivorous diet and they were concerned about this and they wanted to take 75 to 100 milligrams of vitamin C a day, I think they could absolutely do that with not a whole lot of negative effects. I think that this is sort of just an interesting academic conversation. Like, can we get that without doing that? How did our ancestors get that? What does it mean? But ultimately, what we're talking about here is antioxidant balance. So for me as a physician, for you, with the clients you see, like, are there any other tests that you think somebody could do to really look and see? We should probably be measuring vitamin C levels in the serum. I haven't had mine measured in a few months, but 3 or 4 months ago, I had it measured. It was 0.8 milligrams per deciliter, which is about 50 micromole per liter that we talked about. And again, I was eating a lot of salmon roe. I was eating nose to tail and not salmon roe, and I wasn't supplementing vitamin C. And so maybe, that's a reasonable cutoff.
Do you know what Sean Baker's plasma vitamin C is?
No.
You should have a competition.
Is it 0.2? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know either. But isn't he an advocate of just steak?
I think Sean just eats steak and eggs and shrimp, and he's not an advocate for organ meats. But it would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it would be cool. I think it would be cool to just see your. So I mean, I would say, I would guess that there would be few, if any, steak dominant carnivores that have 50 micromoles per liter vitamin C fasting, and you do. So I think that's a very interesting testament to the nose to tail concept.
Yeah.
Which makes total sense. I mean, I don't think you and I have any disagreement over how good the organ meats are as source of vitamin C.
Yeah.
And when I left out kidneys before, it was not to ignore the contribution of kidneys and thymus and other things. I just mentioned the fish roe, clams, mussels, and oysters and crab. I just think most people would eat in higher amounts than those other organs.
What's the vitamin?
Not everyone.
Yeah.
Not you. Most people.
I eat shellfish sometimes. What's the vitamin C content of oysters? I don't know off the top of my head.
It's like 8 milligrams per 100 grams.
Okay. So you'd have to, I'm trying to think how many grams are in one oyster, but if you ate 5 or 6 oysters, you might get a decent amount.
I don't remember how many grams are in an oyster. It's actually highly variable too.
Yeah.
It's like
That's interesting.
Something like that.
Yeah. But I do think that there's this, I think that vitamin C is participating in the antioxidant system. And what else would you measure on your clients to look at oxidative stress, to look at this system? I've measured 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine in myself and lipid peroxide. Both of those were low. I don't know that people will know the reference ranges, so I don't know if it's useful to give my numbers, but I'm happy to. But anything else you would measure to look at I've done GGT, which was 11. Clinically, I'm just trying to see, I know my vitamin C level is 0.8. I'm looking at those oxidative stress markers in myself. They don't seem elevated. I'm just an N of 1. Like you pointed out, someone else may be different. What else do you think about?
Yeah. If I were in charge of making lab tests, I would offer a panel that had everything I wanted in it. But looking at what's available, I think Genova has a oxidative stress 2.0 plasma panel that's pretty useful. It has, as you pointed out, I think the NutriVal has lipid peroxides, which are markers of damage to lipids, and 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a marker of oxidative damage to DNA. Those are on there, and I think they're on the ion panel as well. The oxidative stress 2.0 panel has those, plus it has, excuse me, a couple other. It has a few other things that I think are probably of questionable but interesting significance. Like it has some of the enzymes. It has if I remember correctly, it has glutathione peroxidase activity, which I think is more a marker of selenium status than it is of oxidative stress. And it has superoxide. I think it has the extracellular superoxide dismutase, which is I think a very uncertain marker of anything because it's influenced by zinc and copper status. It's also can increase in oxidative stress. as a reaction to it. So I think it's of questionable significance. If I were designing, and then of course, as standalone tests, I think fasting plasma vitamin C is good for vitamin C status. I think it would be good to measure vitamin E, which, which is vitamin E, period. And then plasma zinc.
Alpha tocopherol, because as far as I know, you can only get alpha tocopherol fraction in the blood, right? Maybe you can get the other ones too. I've only seen alpha tocopherol.
I think Genova offers other fractions, but alpha tocopherol, I think alpha tocopherol is certainly on a carnivore diet. You're mostly getting alpha tocopherol because animals concentrate alpha at the expense of everything else. Mm-hmm. And it is you could debate whether if you're not supplementing with alpha tocopherol, I think you could use alpha tocopherol as an index of vitamin E status without really worrying about the nuances. If you are supplementing with high doses of alpha tocopherol, then you have an issue where there's some evidence that you're washing out other forms of vitamin E. If you're not measuring them, you may get a kind of false signal, but that's not relevant to someone on a carnivore diet or any other diet that's not supplementing with vitamin E. So I think I'd add vitamin E. I would look at the minerals. Glutathione peroxidase activity is as good as I mentioned as a selenium marker, but plasma selenium is the best one. Plasma zinc, serum copper, an iron panel along with ferritin and transferrin are good markers together collectively of iron status. And that takes care of most of the antioxidant minerals. I think lipid peroxides and 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine are good oxidative damage markers, which is not to say oxidative stress. I think it's really important to measure glutathione, but it's like I said before, it's problematic. So LabCorp has a whole blood glutathione test, which I think is the best. And I think Genova includes glutathione on some of those panels, the NutriBal including. But the thing is, in order to measure glutathione, to measure oxidized and reduced glutathione, you need to this is getting technical, but you need to take the plasma sample and immediately precipitate it with perchloric acid, which separates out the proteins and preserves glutathione in that state. And my problem with HDRI, which measures oxidized and reduced glutathione, is that when I've talked to clients who had the test done, they don't do that. So I think LabCorp doesn't offer it because it's such a pain to do. And I don't think like the LabCorp office has perchloric acid in it. And probably the phlebotomist would be like, the hell, I need to be under a fume hood. I wasn't trained for that. So I think these issues that we were talking about with glutathione before are best resolved in a research setting. My laboratory in graduate school centered on this stuff. The DRI for vitamin E was written in part by my research grandmother. So my advisor's postdoctoral advisor was on the board for the DRI for vitamin E, and probably when they resolve it, research that my doctoral advisor did with her will probably be used as the basis for it. And so we did this stuff all the time. Measuring glutathione status. I measured glutathione in a number of animal experiments, and my lab mates measured it in humans. So, what I know about glutathione is we know that oxidative stress and the insulin to glucagon ratio are the two primary regulators. The insulin to glucagon ratio is a signal of how much energy and building blocks you have available, and oxidative stress is a signal of need. And so, in fasting physiology, glutathione completely plummets during the fasting cycle and goes way back up during the feeding cycle. This is known physiology, and it's almost impossible for it to be otherwise because you have an influx of amino acids that you can make glutathione out of during the feeding cycle, and you don't have them during the fasting cycle. They're depleted. And the hormonal regulation places emphasis on insulin. And I don't think I think it would be great to return to those mouse studies at some point, but I did look at the paper on the hippocampus, and I think what's happening there is basically the ketogenic diet is causing oxidative stress that's increasing the demand for glutathione in the hippocampus, and there's a reaction to that that makes more glutathione. But I don't believe if they measured it in the liver or if they used indices of whole body glutathione synthesis that it would be lower. The ketogenic diet was designed by the Mayo Clinic to be a mimic of fasting physiology. Fasting physiology means less glutathione synthesis, period. And in a tissue specific way, that might not be the case. If you have a model of hippocampal damage, you probably have many resources directed in response to that to there. But I don't think, I've heard Dom say on podcasts that he thinks that one of the mechanisms with cancer is by depriving cancer cells of the glutathione that they need to defend themselves. Maybe I'm mishearing him, but I'm quite certain that I've heard Dom say that before. But the appropriate way to excuse me, the appropriate way to resolve this, just because of the limitations of the testing we have, is not for keto clinicians to measure it in their patients. It's for researchers who have the methods available to do really good tests to test the effects of keto diets in people on these markers. And hopefully you can get a surrogate from those studies to use clinically. If you can say, oh, this test is generally corresponding to what they showed in that research study, then I think, that's a good proxy that you could use clinically. But the principle should be defined in research. And I would absolutely hedge my bets on ketogenic diets lowering whole body glutathione synthesis markers. But I don't believe anyone's studied it clearly in humans before. And
I think that the ultimate thing is oxidative stress, right? Because if glutathione goes down, but oxidative stress doesn't go up, then what's the big deal, right? And so that's ultimately what we want to know is what's the oxidative stress level in the body, which again is a difficult thing to measure. It's interesting.
Yeah, but look, we have the markers you're using are markers of oxidative damage. Oxidative damage is things are falling apart because they've been damaged. Oxidative stress is a more general term that should be distinct from that and means that pathways are being dysregulated because of improper control of the flux of antioxidants and oxidants. Glutathione, excuse me. Glutathione, the ratio of reduced to oxidized glutathione regulates the activity of hundreds of proteins. And so, things like cellular proliferation or asthmatic symptoms in the lungs or like mucus fluidity or many things fall under the umbrella of how the oxidized to reduced ratio of glutathione controls them. And these things, it's very hard to measure because they're also compartmentalized in the cell in the way that like the mitochondria has a different redox status than the endoplasmic reticulum, than the cytosol, et cetera, et cetera.
It's so hard to know.
So it's very hard to monitor that in a clinical setting and really just needs to be researched
further. Yeah. It's a tricky thing. Well, I think let's move on to folate.
Yeah, I think vitamin C and antioxidants got us on a million tangents. I think we can probably go through the others a little bit quicker. So look, folate deserves a lot of controversy because the need for folate can't be defined outside the context of other nutrients such as choline. Folate and choline both support methylation. And one of the endpoints you would look at is homocysteine, which increases when you don't have adequate methylation in the fasting state. And choline is best supplied by liver and egg yolks, and actually just other, choline is going to be pretty high on a carnivore diet. Folate is going to be pretty low on a carnivore diet because the only animal food that's really good source of folate is liver. Muscle meats are very
kidney.
Go ahead.
Kidney, I'm pretty sure has good folate too. Am I wrong?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe maybe kidney, but like the bulk of what most people, maybe except you and the people in your sphere of influence, like a steak heavy carnivore diet's going to be very low in folate.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
So like I'd have to relook at kidney. Maybe if you can send me some kidney data after, I'd take a look at it. But the thing is, it's there are several things that are like may statements we could make. So creatine spares the need for methylation by up to half. It may be the case that 2 pounds of meat is going to provide enough creatine to cut the methylation demand in half. And that may translate to a cutting of the folate requirement in half. I'm not sure.
Right.
The data from farmers indicates that because greens are such a good source of folate, and because pastured chickens eat greens, that pastured eggs may be such a good source of folate that you only need 2 of them to meet the RDA for folate.
At
but
400
they
micrograms.
might not, because there's not rigorous data supporting that. And then, it may be the case that the choline in your diet is going to be such a good reducer of the folate requirement that none of it really matters. But most people on a carnivore diet are I would say, have a very significant chance of not hitting the RDA.
Of folate.
We can question the RDA. Yeah, we can question the RDA because it's based on homocysteine, and folate's not the only thing that impacts homocysteine. So I think here I would jump on board much more easily with these other things in the carnivore diet are going to reduce the need for folate than I would for vitamin C. Because I think it's very clear that choline reduces the need for folate. I think it's pretty clear that creatine reduces the need for folate. But these are a lot of may statements. And so it's just like, if I were in charge of a carnivore's health, I would be looking at their folate status. You know what I mean?
Oh, I always do. I always look at, though the serum level of folate is not a great indicator, I'm always going to look at homocysteine and folate levels. And, thanks to much of the work that you have done, the third piece of that equation is riboflavin, which I think should be on your list. Because if people do not eat nose to tail, they could certainly not get enough riboflavin. They may meet the RDA for riboflavin, but I think for many of the people that I work with who have any polymorphism of MTHFR, whether it's 1298 or 677, unless they are getting significantly more than the RDA to the range of 2 to 3 milligrams of riboflavin per day, which, as you have pointed out, can really only be obtained in organs. Liver and kidney are the best sources of that. Their homocysteine is too high, and by too high, it goes above 7. And that's not the only metric of riboflavin status, but I see that repeatedly clinically, that a lot of times I do see people with marginal folate status on meat-only diets. That I've seen for sure. Serum levels of folate that are near the bottom of the reference range. And then if they are not eating organs and they have any MTHFR polymorphism, their homocysteine is almost guaranteed to be above 10, sometimes as high as 15 to 17. And so then I'm thinking, okay, we could supplement or we could use the organs, but if we really want to construct this with an organ, like an actual food-based diet, they're going to need liver or kidney for the riboflavin as well.
Yeah, the reason that I didn't put riboflavin in my list is because I think that's true, but it's not really a function of these people being carnivore. So I guess it could be in the sense that their folate requirement might be messed up because of the interaction between the polymorphisms and the riboflavin and the low folate status of a carnivore diet. But in terms of riboflavin by itself, I think a carnivore is going to have way better riboflavin status than a vegan, and omnivores are going to be in the middle because it's just the case that most of the best riboflavin, I mean, even excluding the organ meats, if you bar organ meats from consideration, most of the good riboflavin sources are animal foods. So red meat, eggs, and salmon are like great sources of riboflavin. Almonds and kidneys are kind of like at the same rank. So this weird almonds is like in there, but for the most part, it's
almonds and what?
Almonds and kidneys have similar amounts, if I remember correctly.
Kidneys had, when I looked it up, because I've been looking at kidneys a lot recently, they had 3.8 milligrams of riboflavin per 100 grams of kidneys. They were pretty good. Yeah,
they're great. But like liver, kidneys, and almonds, when I put my tiering together, I put those in the second tier. Yeah. And then most of what follows, it's like there's some plant foods in there, but they're not, I don't know. carnivore diets should be pretty good in riboflavin, but as you indicated, I think what you said is true. And I think it's just that's more of a fact of just everybody across the board has marginal riboflavin status. And if you have factors that increase riboflavin needs, most people, regardless of their diet, are probably not getting enough.
Yeah, and not getting enough riboflavin can impair the function of your MTHFR and lead to elevated levels of homocysteine and affect the biochemistry. So, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So folate, I think folate's a big one. And one of the things I talked to Ben Lynch about that I don't think anybody knows is the different types of folate. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole right now. I have a theory, a hypothesis that most of the folate in animal foods could be L-methylfolate because that's what they're using in their biochemistry, or perhaps animal foods would be higher in methylfolate, but it's just a hypothesis.
Most folate in foods is a mix of methylfolate and formal folate and the other ones that appear in biochemistry. I am pretty sure I've seen it speciated in liver, but I don't remember the details off the top of my head. But I think animal foods and plant foods both are mixes of those folate forms.
Interesting.
Methylfolate is a predominant one. So those are the other five that I have here. Are what I'd say are conditional risk. I think these are things where how you design the diet is a lot more relevant, but I group them in carnivore risk because they come up more as considering the design of your diet becomes more relevant by the fact that it's a carnivore diet. So one of them is manganese. Like overwhelmingly, plants are richer in manganese than animal foods, and vegetarians have the highest manganese intakes and very much higher compared to omnivores because of greater plant food intake. However, mussels are an excellent source of manganese. You could hit. So I recommend 3 milligrams as a target, which is a little higher than the RDA. And if you had 100 gram serving of mussels, that would fulfill your daily requirement. 3 to 5 servings of Pacific oysters and a handful of fish, freshwater bass, trout, walleye, pike, burbot, drum perch, rainbow smelt, sunfish, and sucker. And then there are a bunch of processed meats that are decent sources of manganese, but I think they're a really bad idea with respect to the previous conversation we had about vitamin C.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know so one thing that's interesting to me is like, if you're a carnivore and you were going to cheat, what would you cheat on? And so, there are some spices where, like, if you didn't want to eat a high volume of plant foods, you could add, what would be a pretty large amount of these spices. So like 10 grams of cloves, ginger, saffron, or cardamom, or 10 to 18 grams of cinnamon or turmeric would give you your manganese requirement.
There'd be a lot of oxalates.
Yeah. So if you're right. So I mean, maybe this is one of the things that's ultimate, so I have a question for you. If you were going to eat a plant food, what plant food would you eat?
No. The answer is no, Chris.
I believe the answer should be dextrose powder.
We can talk about that. I don't know. I think for a lot of people, so I'm writing this book and it's almost done. And I'm writing chapter 12 right now, and it's about how to eat a carnivore diet. And within that chapter, I give a spectrum of plant toxicity that is entirely based on my own creation and opinion, and is not necessarily based on rigorous objective data. But on that plant toxicity spectrum, on the far left side of what I would consider to be less toxic plant foods, I have foods like avocado, olives, squash, and lettuce. So again, it's not a big list.
Just those 4.
Those are the 4 things.
Yeah.
There are some foods in the middle, but maybe it'll get revised before I publish, but I don't think so. But I mean, those would be the things that I would consider to be the least toxic plant foods. Just thinking about lectins and oxalates and just other things that I've sort of made in my own, just to give people a sense of it. But I think within the ketogenic carnivore adjacent community, avocado is probably the main food that is eaten that is not from an animal. Although I haven't had one in a while.
I actually had a client who was eating a carnivore diet plus dextrose.
Okay. Why were they doing that?
Support energy requirements for extremely high physical activity.
Like, what were they doing for that activity?
Well, I don't want to give away identifying information, but it was like very, let's say, competitive body weight sports.
Okay. So they were doing a carnivore diet plus 10 grams of dextrose.
No, 50 grams.
50 grams of dextrose. So they were doing like, and there is a version of the carnivore diet that's like that. I mean, it's called the vertical diet. It's Stan Efferding's, thing where the people eat white rice and meat. And I think that for people who are doing extreme sports, or there's a question of whether the addition of that small amount of carbohydrates could be performance enhancing. So I don't think that's totally out of the realm of possibility.
Well, also, I mean, if you're concerned about plant toxins, dextrose powder should be pretty low in them.
Pretty low, exactly.
Unless you consider glucose a toxin, but
although I generally do not consider glucose a toxin, but we can talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's made by our bodies, so it's probably not too toxic.
Probably not. Okay, so let's round out this list. So molybdenum is on here, and I think there's very sparse data on molybdenum in foods, and so there's a lot of holes in the data. But the thing with molybdenum is that sulfur amino acids raise your requirement for molybdenum, and we don't know by how much. So in my opinion, the only real good way to get molybdenum is to eat liver, and you can hit the molybdenum requirement, which would otherwise, like, the best way to get molybdenum is beans, legumes, beans and other legumes. But 1.25 ounces of liver per day meets the requirement for molybdenum, and so that would be hit by your nose to tail carnivore diet super easily. But it would not be met very easily by someone on a steak-only carnivore diet. And I would be very concerned about the steak-only carnivore diet raising the requirement for molybdenum in a lot of people, even though how much is a question. Because of the excess amino acids that are sulfur-containing, et cetera. Yeah, so molybdenum is required to convert sulfite, which is a toxic form of sulfur, to sulfate. And the more sulfur amino acids you eat, the more sulfite you produce, the more you need to convert it to sulfate. And so sulfate, we mentioned before, has all kinds of beneficial effects in the body. Sulfite has all kinds of toxic effects. It can induce deficiencies of vitamin B1 and vitamin B6. It can destroy the function of a bunch of proteins that can contribute to allergy-like symptoms, hives and itching and things like that. There's a lot of people avoid sulfites in wine and other preserved foods because they react to them. Those people are going to have especially worse problems if their molybdenum intakes are too low. Yeah, absolutely. And then, so I think potassium is a very interesting one. So there's a lot of controversy over the potassium requirement. In fact, the National Academy of Medicine, formerly the Institute of Medicine, who sets the DRIs, which are the RDA and the adequate intake and the tolerable upper intake level and stuff like that, they just this year put out a new adequate intake for potassium that's about half of what it used to be. Oh, wow. But look, and that has nothing to do with like new evidence, and really has everything to do with, in 2017, they came up with new guidelines for how they make the DRIs, and they do them very differently now. So in fact, if they were to set an RDA for vitamin C, they would probably lower it by the new criteria. And what they did was, before, the way they considered the RDA was like, if there really wasn't a very clear delineation of what type of evidence they would use, they would just try to use the best evidence. And so if there was evidence on curing deficiency and nothing else, they'd use that. But if there was evidence on chronic disease risk reduction, they would use that. So the vitamin C requirement is kind of pieced together from different lines of evidence that are all very suggestive of a benefit to chronic disease risk reduction. In the new guidelines, they completely separate, on the one hand, the RDA, which is what they make if there's good evidence of preventing deficiency, how much you need, or the adequate intake, or AI, which they use as a substitute for the RDA when there is not good evidence of how much you need to prevent deficiency, which is generally just an average of what apparently healthy people are eating. And now that's completely separate from the chronic disease risk reduction intake, or CDRR. And that is what would reduce the risk of chronic disease. But in order to make a CDRR, they must have randomized controlled trials with clinical endpoints. And so in this, very interesting, they came out with new AIs and CDRRs for salt and potassium, for sodium and potassium. For salt, they had very big studies. So for both of them, they defined deficiency as having low blood levels. And they said that's not really driven by intake, so we can't use it. So we're just going to set an AI, which is the average of what apparently healthy people are eating. And so for potassium, the AI is what people that don't have high blood pressure are eating. And for sodium, the AI, they said, so for sodium, they said we have these really good clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, showing that sodium reduction reduces the risk of heart disease events, related cardiovascular events, and lowers the incidence of hypertension, which are all clinical endpoints. So they set a CDRR that is lower than what people are eating on average. They set the CDRR as the low sodium arms of the DART trial. And they said they can't make the AI, the adequate intake, what everyone is eating, because what everyone is eating is above the CDRR. So the CDRR says you want to reduce your sodium to what is in the DART trial. Then the AI can't be what the average of what everyone's eating. It has to be lower than that. The AI is set as the sodium restriction arm of the DART trial. Do I have this right? I'm fumbling it up a little bit. They used the low sodium arm of the DART trial. They used that as the AI, and then they set a margin where they said if you have high blood pressure or anything else like that, you should reduce your sodium intake to as low as that or with a little margin above it. And that ranges the CDRR to bring your chronic disease risk reduction down. So for potassium, the old AI in 2005 was set on the basis that that you could abolish the increase in blood pressure that otherwise was caused by salt if you could take your potassium up to 4.7 grams. In other words, you take this group of people that seem to have blood pressure problems,
right?
You give them a dose of salt, their blood pressure goes up. But if you raise their potassium to 4.7 grams, you give them that same dose of salt and nothing happens to their blood pressure. So what they said was, and then there's also a bunch of trials that just show potassium lowers blood pressure. So here's the problem. First of all, they said salt, that study that was used for the 2005 AI was showing that potassium could cure salt sensitivity. But they said, look, salt sensitivity is not clearly defined. There's all kinds of controversy over how to define it. And so we can't look at that study at all. So it got completely discarded. And then they said, so for the AI out now, we're just looking at preventing low blood levels. Diet's mostly unrelated to that. So we'll look at the average intake of potassium in people that don't have high blood pressure. And so the old AI was 4.7 grams, and now it's 2.3 grams for women, and it's like about 3 grams for men. And for CDRR, even though there's a bunch of studies showing potassium lowers blood pressure is not a clinical endpoint. Diagnosis of hypertension is a clinical endpoint, and heart disease events, heart attacks a clinical endpoint, but lowering blood pressure is not. And so because the quality of studies done with potassium is lower than the ones done with sodium restriction, potassium became a victim of the lower quality of evidence. And so there's no CDRR at all for potassium. And what's ridiculous is everything about the physiology says that the blood pressure is driven by the balance of sodium and potassium. In other words, that old study wasn't showing that 4.7 grams of potassium abolishes salt sensitivity. There's no such thing as salt sensitivity. Salt has to be balanced by potassium. And if it's not, one of the consequences is your blood pressure can increase. And so it's like the research became a victim of the fact that for the last 2-3 decades, when people have been doing these studies, no one knew that they were going to revise the criteria in 2017. So it's like, on the one hand, the criteria is better now. You need a randomized controlled trial of a clinical effect to say it reduces chronic disease. Like, if you're an evidence guy, you say, or an evidence gal, you say like, good, you know. But it's like, it's one thing to say, this is what we're going to do going forward. Now let's design these good trials. It's a whole nother thing to say like, haha, you know, you dumbasses that were conducting the studies 20 years ago, you measured blood pressure instead of the incidence of hypertension. So we're not going to look at your study. Like, that's basically what they did, right? Like all those people, if they knew that was going to be the criteria, they would have reported their results in incidence of hypertension. But no one had any idea. So they reported milligrams per, milligrams mercury, or whatever. They reported blood pressure instead of the incidence of hypertension. And so like the research fell as a victim to that. So in the current numbers, you want 2.3 grams if you're an adult woman, you want 3 grams if you're an adult man. I stand by the old numbers. I think that the optimal target would be to get up to 4.7 grams of potassium. And so look, with a carnivore diet, you have 2 things going on. One is that your potassium from your meats is going to get a lot of it's going to get lost in the juices if you're cooking them in ways that let all the juices be discarded. The other thing is, the more fat and collagenous tissue you put into your diet, the more it's displacing lean meats that have most of the potassium in them. Now, another part of this is, if you're eating a carnivore diet, you probably have a fairly moderate sodium intake that's consistent with the sodium reduction trials if you're not adding salt to your diet. So probably if your sodium intake is like, and also that's even all the more true if you're adding fat and collagenous tissues into your diet, right? Because fat's just not that high in electrolytes. Electrolytes are water soluble. So I think like, I don't want to say everyone has to have 4.7 grams, but I think that you should feel free. Oh, the other thing is fish and shellfish can be very, like certain crabs are like ridiculously high in sodium. So if you're eating land animals, you're going to have a lower sodium intake than if you're eating a lot of seafood. So I think that you should give thought in designing a carnivore diet to the balance of sodium and potassium. And I think if you're eating a seafood heavy diet, and you're not eating a lot of fat and collagenous tissues, you're probably going to have a higher sodium intake where you want to be more mindful of your potassium intake. And if you're salting your food to taste, anyone, carnivore or not, should be mindful of their potassium intake. And if you're salting your food to taste and that's leading you to have a salt intake of 2, 3, 4, 5 grams, then you probably really should emphasize getting enough potassium by preserving the juices and having a lower intake of fat and a higher intake of lean meats. If you're not dumping salt on your food and you're not eating a very seafood heavy diet and your sodium is like 1.5 grams a day, then I think you could feel safe getting, the current AI of 2.3 grams for an adult woman, 3 grams for an adult man. But you should still be conscious of the principles that in a carnivore diet, because the meats are the only source of potassium, losing the juices in your meat is a negative, and displacing, and even though including fat and collagenous tissue is otherwise a good thing, it is going to reduce your potassium intake.
And ultimately, with potassium, I guess the first clinical endpoint is blood pressure. So if somebody has high blood pressure, they might want to be more mindful of this. And if somebody is normotensive or has normal blood pressure, you might say, well, that's, maybe I'm getting enough potassium given your blood levels of potassium are good. Now, another test people can do is a red blood cell potassium, which might give them a sense of total body potassium store is an imperfect measure to be sure, but between serum potassium and red blood cell potassium and normal blood pressure, we might think, okay, we're probably doing okay with potassium. I think a lot of carnivores are probably getting more than 1.5 grams of sodium per day. Now, we should be careful to distinguish between intake of sodium chloride and intake of sodium. 1.5 grams of sodium would be 3 grams of salt, and 3 grams of salt would be a little less than a teaspoon. I think most people are probably getting upwards of 5 grams, at least I know I am, of sodium chloride per day. And I actually published a study
How are you measuring that? Are you talking about added sodium chloride, or are you summoning the sodium and chloride in your food?
I'm talking about added sodium chloride.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because there's a marginal amount. I shouldn't say marginal. There's a small amount, a reasonably small amount of sodium in meat, but not a ton. It's like
there's enough to get a gram or a gram and a half on a carnivore diet, probably.
Yeah, just in the meat. Yeah, but there was an interesting study that I talked about in one of my newsletters where, granted, these were people who were not eating a carnivore diet, but I believe it was 7 women who were given 2.2 grams of sodium per day, and it was not enough to fully suppress renin, suggesting that their bodies were trying to even conserve more of the sodium. So the balance. How
long was this study?
I forget. I have to go back and look at it. I think it was only
do you know if it was like a week or two versus
I think it was a week or two. Yeah, it was a week or two. It was a short study. Yeah. So maybe it wasn't long enough for the renin to be suppressed, but there on the flip
I think
side,
there are adaptations where a 4 to 6 week study is probably gonna show equilibration of those systems that's not going to be seen in a week or two.
Yeah. And then the flip side is that if we get too little sodium, our body will do this system exactly where the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system will be activated in order to conserve sodium, and that will create some degree of insulin resistance just to hold on to the sodium.
So I'm definitely not arguing for sodium restriction. I actually think everyone is better having a lot of salt and potassium. So right. I think people are I think it's very unfortunate that the new numbers, even though it's the result of moving the system to like demand a higher quality of evidence, we've become a victim of the fact that the evidence basis is very skewed towards the hypotheses that people were investigating, where sodium restriction for cardiovascular health was one of the giant hypotheses that took over, everyone. And so it's very unfortunate that the practical result of that is that now everyone's is recommended to get low intakes of all of them instead of getting high intakes of all of them. Yeah. But the thing is like, I think 3, 4, 5, 6 grams of sodium is probably good if your potassium is like 4.7 to 10 grams of potassium a day. But look, like it's hard to get 4.7 grams of potassium on a carnivore diet without adding it, and it's impossible to get 11 grams on a carnivore diet without adding it. But think about this for a second. So the non-carnivore sector of paleo in academia, like the Boyditin and all the early people in paleo,
Cordain,
so they did an analysis of extant hunter-gatherers where they suggested paleo intakes of potassium were 11 grams a day, where it's mostly coming from plant foods. And I think no one really knows the animal versus plant intakes of Paleolithic people, but I think it's very clear that if you look anthropologically, intakes of plant foods are lowest in the Arctic and they're highest at the equator. And so, there's never been a desire of any human population for a fully vegan or fully carnivore diet. I'm not saying there's no people that ate that way, but there was at a population level, the traditional diets were about 37% animal foods at the equator, where plant foods were most abundant. And they got as much plants as they could in the Arctic, where plants were scarce. And so they didn't eat a lot of plants, but they did whatever they could to eat plants. We evolved in the equator. So
where was that measured?
Where was what measured?
37% plant foods at the equator?
I think it comes from the Kung San.
in Africa, sub-Saharan
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
And when was it measured?
Probably a couple decades ago.
Now, Miki Ben-Dor has a really interesting theory about this. I actually was just talking to him yesterday. He's a paleoanthropologist. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'll just add this briefly. And I do think it's a very valid point when we're considering those. Lauren Cordain and Boyd Eaton in the paleospheres have used these sort of numbers of the amount of plant foods eaten by indigenous peoples around the world to estimate what we might have done in our ancestral history. But Miki said he actually sent me a copy of this paper that he submitted. And his premise is that perhaps looking at living hunter-gatherers is not always the best indication of what ancestral peoples might have done, because these hunter-gatherers are living in a time that is not like what it was in the past. I would imagine that even a few decades ago, the governments of the regions of Africa were limiting these people's ability to hunt big game, to hunt elephants, and they were probably corralled, for lack of a better word, to a limited amount of space, and their ability to be nomadic was limited. So though your point is well taken that people near the equator do appear to eat more plant foods now, I do wonder, as a sort of alternative hypothesis or a counterpoint, if this is the best indication of what they might have done 80,000 years ago. And certainly, at least, I think we have to take into account that the political climate was different, and they can't really live the same way.
I kind of agree with the general principles, but my recollection is that I don't remember how often they ate giraffe, but the Kung San, where this measurement came from, were one of their primary sources of food was giraffes, which are very big. And the way that they would operate was like, it would take a whole band of men to go out and hunt a giraffe. And then they'd come back with a giraffe and they would just eat nothing but the giraffe for like 2 weeks. But they didn't necessarily want to go right out and get another giraffe, because it takes a whole band of men to go out on this expedition. It's relatively easy to forage for plant foods and smaller animals
if they're available.
Yeah. So, I mean, so look, like a lot of this is going to be dictated by food availability. I mean, certainly, in the era of the megafauna, you got more. It was easier to get more calories by killing this slow-moving, gigantic thing, and you're going to feast off that for a while.
Don't you think that would have been cool? Don't you wish that you and I were in a tribe and we could go hunt the woolly mammoth, dude? I want to do that with you. I wish.
Well, I'm sure we can bring the woolly mammoth back in time and set up a park.
That would be amazing.
But we all know how that went in the movie. But anyway. Like it goes both ways, right? So like there's famously someone asked one of the Kung San, you see agriculture all around you. Why don't you develop agriculture? And they said, why should I, with all these mongongo nuts around? And so it's like, it's sort of like, they could have said, you hunted a giraffe last week. Why aren't you hunting a giraffe this week? And they're probably going to say, why should I with all these mongongo nuts around? I mean, it's like, to some extent, the behavior is going to be driven by caloric needs, but not entirely. It's also going to be driven by I'm sure they had preferences of what they like to eat, but also knowledge about how to balance the diet and things like that. But anyway, look, we don't know exactly what our ancestors ate, but one of the upper boundary of potassium intakes, based on people who favor the idea of generalizing from plant foods that current hunter-gatherers intake, is about 11 grams. And people are not going to get that on a carnivore diet. But I think it's a pretty good point that neither are you getting 5 grams of sodium chloride on a carnivore diet. I mean, you're not getting it from plants, but you're adding it as a supplement.
Yes, I am.
And I don't think there's anything unnatural about that. Wild animals go to salt licks.
Right.
Humans made salt for probably longer than anyone appreciates in the sodium restriction circles. But also salt licks have other minerals besides sodium chloride. And so and actually I want to go back to one really important point. So I agree with you.
Let's just talk about can I just mention one thing real quickly?
Sure.
So I think I love that you brought up this anecdote about the Kung San. Isn't it cool that when they had the giraffe, they ate nothing but the giraffe for 2 weeks? And the reason I'm highlighting this is from the perspective of just sort of gently making the point that in many indigenous cultures, when animal foods are available, often plant foods are shunned. And there are quotes from Vilhjalmur Stefansson and Fatted Land and Hunters of the Great White North that the Inuit would do the same thing. And though it's a wide sweeping generalization and we can't extend it widely, isn't that interesting that when they had a big kill of giraffe, they just ate that and nothing else? Because I do think that
but they didn't shun plant foods because they ate like 63% plant foods.
Well, but when they had the giraffe, when they had the recently killed giraffe in front of them, they just when animal foods were available, when they had a kill, they favored the animal foods, which is consistent with the pattern that we see in at least the writings of Vilhjalmur Stefansson looking at the Inuit, the Mackenzie River Inuit, other populations in the north.
I think there's an element there, but it's like it takes a certain amount of work to get a giraffe and it takes less work to pick a mongongo nut. And so it's like there's a balance. There's a dynamic balance between putting in the work to get the giant animal and not feeling like getting any of the foods that don't require that much work. And then the animal goes away and you're not that motivated to do it again. But right now you're full of giraffe and now you really want the easier mongongo nuts.
Maybe, yeah.
So, but I think the net balance is what is important nutritionally. And I think the net balance is what is important. It's what nutritionally. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that everyone, I don't know what all the motivations are, but I think there's motivations to seek calories. There's motivations to seek health. There's motivations to seek taste. And there's always motivations to avoid work. And so it's sort of like, if you hunt the giraffe, it's actually less work to eat the rest of the giraffe than it is to like go forage plants. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of motivations that come into play there. I don't know the Inuit, like I would have to, it's been a while since I read anything from Stefansson. I actually have a copy of My Life with the Eskimo back there on the shelf that has some signed letter by Stefansson.
Oh my God.
But like when Weston Price described the Inuit, his list of plant foods that they ate is actually longer than his list of animal foods. Not that he was saying that they ate more plants than animals. But also Nor Jones has written an entire book about the plant foods eaten by the Inuit, which I have not read. It's called The Plants We Eat.
Yeah.
So I don't feel competent to try to summarize the Inuit attitude towards plant foods, but I don't think it can be entirely encapsulated by they shunned plant foods when animal foods were available, because they often went through great lengths. And I think it was different by different subgroups too.
Yeah. I'll read a couple of quotes. So
sure.
The Eskimo situation varies from ours still more when it comes to vegetables. In the Mackenzie district, these were eaten under 3 conditions. The chief occasion.
Who are you reading from?
This is Stefansson. Yeah. Okay. This is from Fatted Land. The chief occasion for vegetables here, as with most Eskimos, was famine. 2, that's number 1. 2, some vegetable foods were eaten because Mackenzie River people liked them. One form of vegetable dish is eaten strictly in connection with another that is non-vegetable. The moss, twigs, and grass from a caribou's stomach are used as a basis for oil. So, I mean, that sort of maybe supports both of our points. But the thing was that he says the principal basis was famine. Again, this is just Vilhjalmur Stefansson writing. And then there was another quote also from the Fat of the Land. Carl Lumholtz reported after living with the natives of tropical northern Australia, they ate nothing vegetable if meat was on hand. I just thought those were interesting sort of snippets of anthropology that can't be extrapolated entirely.
Yeah. I can't comment on those really, except to say that like I'd have to familiarize myself with more people who spend time with the Inuit to get a better appreciation of that. And I think it's very easy for some of these explorers sometimes to be very biased by what they find super interesting about a culture. And I can really imagine some people being like, holy crap, these people eat so many animal foods, and running away with it. I know that's exactly what happened with the Maasai. So I was completely fascinated when I started doing a lot of I did, I mean, much more than I've ever done with the Inuit or any other group. I read many books about the Maasai, and I went doing a lot of research that I could only do in a library because I was getting old books that were only on microfilm. And one of the things that I had always heard about the Maasai was that they just ate meat, blood, and milk. And in fact, Price says something of that nature in his book, and it's so wrong that it's nuts. So what I learned part of this was that there were a lot of rumors of the Maasai, and they were romanticized as bloodthirsty warriors. And so there were a lot of people from Britain or other places who spent a couple months with them or something like that, and took away something and like amplified the rumors. And this guy, Moritz Merker, I think he was a German general or something like that, but he, if you Google his name and my name, you'll probably come up with a blog post I wrote about it. But he spent 8 years living with them and documented very extensively what they were eating. And the only people who ate a mostly carnivorous diet among the Maasai were the warriors, who were men between certain ages.
Right.
But even their diet was extremely not carnivorous. So they would when they would have their meat parties, they would take copious amounts of herbs and they would mix them all together. There's a significant list of the herbs that they would use. They would never eat the meat without the herbs. Some of them were antimicrobial, and that was probably why. But they would make like these teas that they would drink at these meat parties. So even at the height of the tendency towards carnivory in the Maasai, they're still getting tons of plant foods. As a percentage of their calories is probably nil because these are herbs. But in terms of like polyphenol intake and possibly vitamin intake,
we'll have to talk about polyphenols in part 2.
Yeah. But look, the rest of the people were trading milk with neighboring tribes for things like bananas and oats and all kinds of stuff like that. And this is the earliest look at the Maasai from anyone who actually spent a lot of time with them. And they consumed a very large number of starches that they didn't grow themselves, but that they traded with other groups. And so it's like, you could read some of those people and you could get a very different impression from reading other of those people. And so I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile Stephenson with some of the other people that have written about the Inuit, nor about how to reconcile the attitudes of the different Inuit groups. But yeah, there's certainly one of the themes that's present in anthropology is some groups had a strong preference for animal foods.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've probably done more research on the Maasai than I, but my impression is that that when they were part of the warrior class, the Maasai would do that diet that was meat and blood and milk. And then once they moved out of the warrior class, when they were aged 40 or something, they would go back to eating like you were suggesting, almost westernized foods or completely different foods when they were not in the warrior class. And I think that often people have generalized the Maasai warrior diet of 20 to 40-year-old males to the whole culture. And I don't think that's true. I think that, but it does seem...
They also ate a lot of honey when they were on the march, even as warriors.
Interesting. That's the dextrose.
And of course the women, the women never ate like that. And I wouldn't call it westernized foods. I mean, it was Africanized foods. It was the traditional foods of the agricultural Africans around them.
Really? They grew oats?
Yeah, in fact, there's a subset of Maasai who are settled agriculturalists called the Arusha, and they speak the same language, Ma, which makes them Maasai, but they're kind of like the Maasai. So there's a bunch. The Maasai are a federation of different groups,
right? And
they're bound by all speaking Ma. And the Maasai that are cattle herders look down upon hunters and agriculturalists. So like hunters are like, they won't eat wild game at all because a hunter is like satanic or whatever. And they look down on hunters, blacksmiths, and the Arusha, who are the agriculturalist Maasai. But also there's a bunch of other tribes in Africa. They're not like isolated. And so they had trading partners. I mean, what modern Western capitalism didn't invent trade, you know?
No, I agree. So there were a few more things on your list. I think we should just wrap it up now and do a part 2 because there are so many things that we didn't get to talk about. But you'd also mentioned vitamin K, let's just talk about that briefly, and then we should wrap it up.
Yeah. Okay. So for vitamin K, I think like there's a few different forms of vitamin K. There's one form that's found in plant foods that's not in animal foods. There's one form that's found in animal foods that's not found in any plant foods. And there's forms in fermented foods. If you're on a carnivore diet, if you're not including fermented foods like cheese, then you're probably mostly getting MK4, which definitely has an essential role in the body and might be not as good at supporting blood clotting. So you might need more of it to get adequate blood clotting. But that's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, I've never seen evidence that that's the case, but yeah, I'm curious about that.
Well, no, there is evidence that it is less effective than K1 or MK7 at supporting blood clotting. Whether there's any evidence that any carnivore has defective blood clotting because of that, I don't know. So, I mean, that's a totally different question is what I mean. But right. it is the case that MK4 is less effective. Now, this is one of the interesting things that I've never been able to figure out because the Rotterdam study is an epidemiology study that I'm sure you're familiar with that showed by tertile the people in Denmark who were eating the most vitamin K, which was actually vitamin K2, which is actually not a large amount of vitamin K. I think the upper tertile was 32 micrograms per day or something like that, something small, had the lowest rates of pretty clear. It was an observational epidemiology study, but it had pretty clear decline in rates of cardiovascular disease and calcific aortic stenosis. What was interesting about that study, but there was no correlation with vitamin K1. And as I've heard you talk about in some other podcasts, humans appear to be pretty bad at converting K1 to K2, suggesting that we probably need to get K2 from animal foods. And I'm personally of the opinion that K1 is not as valuable as K2. And the hypothesis that we don't even need any K1 in our diets and that we could perhaps just retroconvert MK4, MK7, MK11, or some of the other isoforms of vitamin K2 back into K1. But I'm not sure about that. Are you not sure? You don't think we can retroconvert? I'm sure we can't do that.
You cannot retroconvert K2?
I mean, if you find a study showing it to be the case, I'll change my mind. But for now, I'm very positive that you can't do that.
And then, I guess that brings up
But it might not matter. So, yeah. Well, look, I always have said exactly what you're saying, but I was never talking to carnivores before.
Right.
So like in the Rotterdam study, there were no carnivores. Maybe there was one carnivore dude. I can't be certain, but like for all practical intents and purposes, there were no carnivores. And so the vitamin K1 intakes were very high compared to vitamin K2 intakes because that's what happens in people that eat plants. That's totally a different situation in carnivores. So I think it's sort of like the question of whether maybe you don't need any K1 in your diet and maybe MK4 is the most important form. I agree with that, but it's sort of how is that not a moot point when you're talking to carnivores? Well, you know what I mean? Like if you're a carnivore talking to other carnivores, you're not debating whether you should eat kale today.
No, but I think that if we're a carnivore talking to other omnivores, or if we're talking to people who are talking about,
if you want to defend the carnivore diet,
yeah, exactly. That's the
you're proselytizing,
yeah, or making a case for it. Look, the carnivore diet is a pretty controversial thing, so we've got to have some like reasonably sound, intellectual frameworks upon which to base things. But I do think it's interesting that humans probably don't need vitamin K1 or don't appear to, and that perhaps vitamin K2 is the active form. And as you're suggesting, I'd love to look at more of the studies that talk about the way that vitamin K2 is participating in clotting, though I'm not sure all of the details regarding the different isoforms are fully understood. But I've never heard of any carnivores having bleeding problems.
Yeah, they're not.
I suppose we could do PTINRs and APTTs on all the carnivores, and I don't think it'd be a problem.
I think it's worth throwing the note out there, but I think the main issue is we probably want like 100 to 200 micrograms of K2 a day, and I think if you're, so in your diet, your diet is probably significantly higher in K2 and in more diversified forms than, say, a steak only diet. I think that's, you can make a case for diversifying K2 forms by including organ meats. And I don't know. I mean, how many carnivores do you consider dairy products carnivore?
I mean, I think that though I don't like to really get strict about the ideology of these things, I think most people would consider dairy products to be carnivore, though in a separate discussion another time, I could talk about some of the hesitations I have with dairy products from an immunologic perspective, just in terms of observational clinical stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And so fermented dairy products are another way to get diverse forms of vitamin K in the diet. If you're talking about a meat only diet, then I think, apart from organ meats and fermented dairy products, in a meat only diet, the best source of K2 is actually dark chicken meat. And if you were to include that, like if you had an all beef diet, you'd probably get around 65 micrograms of K2, which I think is like borderline okay. And if you replaced 5% of that with dark chicken meat, you get 100 micrograms, which I think is good. And if you replaced 15% of it with dark chicken meat, you get 200 micrograms, which I think is excellent. So I'm not saying carnivores are all deficient in vitamin K. I think it's a consideration that comes up because of carnivore. But vitamin K2 is enriched in many of the organ meats like liver and kidney as well. And they also have the benefit that they have a more diverse, or the liver at least has a more diverse profile of K vitamins. So it has MK4 and MK7? Yeah. And it probably probably some K1 if that animal is an herbivore. Oh, interesting. And then here's an interesting thing. I'll be curious to get your perspective on that. If I look online at some of the highest sources of vitamin K2, they are, goose liver and emu oil, right? Emu oil is particularly high, and duck fat has a lot of vitamin K2. And though I wish that someone, and again, this is within the realm of conjecture because I'm not sure anyone will repeat this, but though the amounts of vitamin K2 in animal fat, grass-fed animal fat, actually not grass-fed, but the amount of vitamin K2 in animal fat, beef fat, has been measured, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were higher. I mean, vitamin K2 is essentially a fat-soluble molecule, right? Why would this... I don't know. I wonder if vitamin K2 might partition to animal fat in a bigger way than we are currently thinking about it as. And though we know that vitamin K2 is enriched in liver and kidney and the organ meats, I also wonder whether animal fat, particularly grass-fed animal fat, might be a great source of vitamin K2 that we're not thinking of if vitamin K2 ends up in things like emu oil. Yeah, I mean, so emu oil is great per 100 grams. I don't know if you can get your hands on like a block of emu oil, but it's sold in capsules, right? Where it's like very good as a natural source of K2, but it's, in terms of like spreading it on you probably eat a lot more beef suet than you could emu oil with what you have access to, I'm guessing. Oh yeah, I don't have any emu fat. So you partner with White Oaks, right? And they make goose liver. They probably do. I'm on some notification system for when it's back in stock. I don't think I've gotten that notification over the last year. I'll talk to them. I talk to them all the time. You should come to White Oak Cella, by the way, December 14th and 15th. White Oak Cella? White Oak Cella, yeah. Is DJ Khaled going to be there? I hope so. Mark Sisson might be there. Ken Berry might. We'll see. It's going to be good. Anyway, I bet that I could pull some strings at White Oak and get you some goose liver. Yeah? Yeah. Okay. But I do wonder about the amount of K2 in tallow or suet, things like this. So the Weston Price measured a bunch of things, and I'd be surprised if they didn't measure tallow. I think they found some high amounts in bear fat or something like that. But I mean, from what I've seen, tallow and lard are not that high in nutrients unless the animal was exposed to unusually high amounts of those nutrients. I don't know. Some animal fats are. I don't know. I don't know why they differ, but maybe if you raise the beef animal in the right way, maybe. But I don't know. I haven't seen that. It is really interesting that there are multiple isoforms of vitamin K2 in the organ meats. Yet another
yet another thing there. So,
Yeah.
well, anything else? I think this is a good place to pause. We're definitely going to have to do part 2. We've already done more than 2 hours.
Yeah.
Anything else that you wanted to touch on, or are you ready for the closing question, Chris?
I am ready for the closing question.
The closing question that I ask all of my guests is, what is the most radical thing that you have done in the last month, my friend?
The most radical thing that I've done? How do you define radical?
How do you define radical?
Changing the foundations of something.
It's radical. I'm a child of the 80s, man. Did you ever see that movie in the 80s, Rad? It's a movie about freestyle biking.
Are you thinking of it like the Michelangelo from the Ninja Turtles?
Yes.
Like radical dude.
That's
like that?
That's the way I think about it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
But I'll leave it up to your interpretation. I'll leave it up to your interpretation.
I was thinking of it from like a political thing or something like that.
No, you don't know.
I went on a 9-day trip to Hawaii with my girlfriend.
You just get back?
No, I just got back from Austin with her.
Oh. Where did you go? Where did you go? Where did you go in Hawaii?
In Hawaii? I went to, actually, so radical. So I'm really scared of heights. And in Hawaii, on the Big Island, I took an open door helicopter tour. So this helicopter has no doors on it. And like when it like takes a turn, it almost comes down like this if it's turning left. So you're like looking straight down the open door. So I agreed with this on the condition that I would be in the middle, the pilot would be on my left, and my girlfriend would be on the right.
And they would fall out first.
Yeah, that was pretty rad.
Presumably there are some pretty robust seatbelts there.
Yeah, they're pretty robust seatbelts, but like when you're afraid of heights, it doesn't necessarily, it's not like logically and rationally, I'm not going to fall out.
What was that like, Chris? What did you feel like as you were like, doing that?
So I was real nervous when I went up, and I kept repeating to myself inside my head, everything of value is on the other side of fear. And I will be so proud when this is done. and then at first I would only look out the windshield, which, I was in the middle, so I could do that if I avoided looking to the right or left. But then after I was up for about 5 or 10 minutes, I started mostly looking at the open door. And then after about 10 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes, I calmed down a lot, and I felt like I didn't need my mantra anymore. So I just enjoyed it. And then I felt that when I landed, I was like, felt like I'm going to get my pilot's license.
Now you're just all in. Now you're fully all in. That's amazing. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think in part 2, you and I can correspond via email, but we should talk about ketosis. We should talk about CPT1A. We should talk about acid-base balance.
Yeah.
We can talk about all kinds of good stuff. I think people will be excited to hear about that. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Thank you for coming on, sir. I totally appreciate your generosity with your time, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon.
Can't wait.
This episode is brought to you by Ample. Ample is a meal in a bottle that takes a total of 2 minutes to prepare, consume, and clean up. It provides a balance of fat, protein, and carbs, plus all the vitamins and minerals you need in a single meal, all from a blend of natural ingredients. It's available in original, vegan, and keto versions, portioned as either 400 or 600 calories per meal. I'm an advisor to Ample, and I use it to save time when I'm working on major projects on a tight schedule. It keeps my brain going while I power through the day, never letting food prep get in the way of my productivity. Head to amplemeal.com and enter the promo code CHRIS15 at checkout for a 15% discount off your first order. This episode is brought to you by Ancestral Supplements Grass-Fed Beef Brain. Our Native American ancestors believed that eating the organs from a healthy animal would support the health of the corresponding organ of the individual. Ancestral Supplements has a nose-to-tail product line of grass-fed liver, organs, bone marrow, brain, and more, all in the convenience of a capsule. For more information or to buy any of their products, go to ancestralsupplements.com. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the carnivore debate Remember that this is just part 1. We have part 2 coming up where Paul Saladino, MD, came on my podcast, Mastering Nutrition, and I will be releasing that for the first time either tomorrow or in the next few days. And then a few days later, Dr. Saladino will release it on his podcast. Remember, if you would like my free guide to getting your vitamins and minerals on a carnivore diet, go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/carnivore. And please check out Dr. Saladino's stuff at carnivoremd.com and check out his podcast, Fundamental Health. I hope to see you in part 2.